Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be here with the Cutman, Mike Rodriguez from Los Angeles. Hey, thanks for allowing me have some of your time and, of course, joining this interview. How do you feel?
Good, good. It's nice to be on with you. It's good seeing and talking to you again. I think the last time we talked, it was about 2 years ago in New York.
Yes, exactly. You were working with I can't remember. I can't pronounce the fighter's name. He's he was great. He did great things on that night, especially also josesito against Thurman, right?
Yes, yeah, I believe it was probably maybe Tube Scott Niambar from Mongolia. I think when he beat Claudio Marrero for the IBO featherweight title at Barclays Center. I believe that's the night it was.
Yes, yes, it is. Yep, you remember that very well. Hey, let's mention this fighter that actually before anything happened, he actually had an incident, a car, accident. Let's say correctly, Errol Spence, and he came, very prepared to fight Danny Garcia. What do you think about this outcome that eventually he pulled out the victory?
I worked with Errol early in his career, so I hadn't worked with him for a couple years. But because of the pandemic, I was hired by the promotion to work the cuts for a lot of the fighters, including josesito Lopez that night and Sebastian Fondura and Eduardo Ramirez, who fought on the card as well. So I had Errol Spence. I thought he did great. Danny Garcia is a two-division world champion. Um, he's a he's a really really good fighter. He's been in with the best, and it was a good competitive fight. And Errol didn't take the easy way out. He could have taken an easier fight, but his fight before that was with Sean Porter, and I think it was good and it was great because it was in Texas and there was a crowd there. It wasn't completely packed, but there was about 15,000 people there, and it was a really good event. And I think he wanted to prove something to himself, that he hadn't lost a step, and I think he did.
Yeah, eventually he did pretty well. A lot of people that were thinking maybe because the accident probably he might not be the same Errol Spence, but on that night, I mean, he proved that he's still the champion and hey, he did a tremendous job. To me, I was very impressed because I was like, who if he Errol Spence is really 100% prepared because these injuries that he had in this car accident, whoa, I mean, he's alive and thank God that he's okay, right?
Yes. Yeah, in the welterweight division, there's so many great fighters. You have Errol Spence, and you have Manny Pacquiao, who's still the WBA champion, and you have Terence Crawford, and you have guys like Yordenis Ugas, Danny Garcia, Sean Porter, who's been a two-time world champion, and then you got other guys that are looking to make some noise. You got guys like Jamal James. I mentioned Ugas. You got guys like Josesito Lopez. You still have guys like Keith Thurman. And that's not even mentioning new guys that are going to be a real problem. Guys like Jaron Ennis. You have former world champion who I worked with, Sergey Lipinets.
Yeah.
There's a lot of guys in that division that can do a lot of things. And if they fight each other, it's just great for boxing.
Yes, it is. I actually there is a name that I think he's making noise and he's pretty tough. I mean, I think his fights vergil Ortiz, right?
That, you know what? I don't mean to leave Virgil out. And he's like Jaron Ennis. He's looking to take that next step. And I think that next step for both guys, is to fight. Some of the guys that we just mentioned, and that's when you'll know if they're going to be at that level.
Yep. What are your thoughts on? I mean, eventually this fight will happen. It will take times. I mean, always politics. Errol Spence and Terence Crawford. What do you think if this fight happens? Who will win on this fight? I already got my, I already pick up, who could win for this fight, and I got Errol.
Well, well, I think they both can beat each other. It's going to be who can dictate the pace of the fight and get the other to fight each other's fight. Both are undefeated world champions. They've both been world champions for several years. I think it comes down to a personal preference. Both of them are good with both hands. They're great at controlling range. They're great at controlling distance and the pace of the fight. And I think it's a pick 'em fight. There are times where I think, maybe Crawford has an advantage, and there are times where I think Errol has an advantage. The one advantage that I think that Errol has, and this is not taking anything away from Terence Crawford, because I think he's a great fighter, is Errol has already been tested against better competition. That doesn't mean that's taking away anything from Crawford, because he could have easily done the same thing, if not better, to that competition. But I have more that I've seen from Errol Spence in that regard, and I would love to see the same from Terence Crawford. I think you're going back to great welterweight fights. You're going back to Mosley De La Hoya. You're going back to De La Hoya Trinidad. You're going back to, Pernell Whitaker, Buddy McGirt. You're going back to Donald Curry, Milt McCory, and I keep working my way back. Wilfred Benitez, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearn, Sugar Ray Leonard. So you start to see a theme here that the great fighters, that they fought each other. I think that's what everybody wants.
Exactly. This is a tough division where we gonna see all these fighters. I mean, Pacquiao is right there. Also, a lot of people thought that Pacquiao was done, and
They don't sleep on Manny. I'm fortunate enough, in addition to working with Errol, I've worked with Sean Porter. I work with Yordenis Ugas, with trainer Ismael Salas from Cuba, who's just a great guy. And I work with Manny, and I was fortunate enough this last fight with Thurman, even though it's, you've been a year and a half, to be in camp with them, and with Freddie Roach and Justin Fortune, and Boo Boy, and I worked the Keith Thurman fight for Manny, and Manny, he's timeless, man. He's as great as ever. And when you look back at 20 years, Manny has been in these big fights for 20 years. Some of the guys that are fighting now were little babies when Manny was already on pay-per-view fighting in Vegas in front of thousands of people with millions of people watching. So, it's just a matter of getting through this pandemic, things getting back to a little bit of normal, and I think that's the great thing about Manny Pacquiao, despite being the only 8-division world champion, is in a lot of ways, like all the great fighters that I mentioned before, he's fought he's fought everybody, and he's not going to ever shy away from a challenge. To him, being great, in my opinion, means accepting those challenges, and that's what greatness is. It's not about protecting a record or being exposed. It's about putting yourself out there to be great, to risk things. In order to be great, you have to risk things. And I think Manny showed that over the course of 2 decades now, that he's that kind of fighter and that kind of person.
yes, you are right. I mean, he had proved. He already done so many things in his career, and I think we will still. I always tell people we're still gonna see more of Manny Pacquiao, even though people might say, "Oh, he's older," but hey, I think they're falling asleep on Manny Pacquiao.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
Eventually, Errol Spence, I think he accomplished what he wants in his life. I think have all the titles. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I remember he mentioned that he would like to face Canelo, because one time I spoke with Coach Derek, and he says that Errol's weight, sometimes he walks at 160. So I guess that fight can make it happen if Canelo goes down 160 maybe. Do you think that it will be this fight taking place in the future, or Errol has no chance to face Canelo?
Well, I think that the first part is the fighters want to have to face each other. Well, Canelo always is not going to turn down a challenge. Errol's not going to turn down a challenge. And if they can somehow work it out, I think it's great for boxing. When you look at world champions that have went up in weight, Duran did it. He was the lightweight champion of the world. He didn't even fight at junior welterweight. He went right up to welterweight to challenge Sugar Ray Leonard. Sugar Ray Leonard was a welterweight, junior middleweight. He went up and he challenged Marvin Hagler. So you have, historically, you have a lot of fighters that have done that. Alexis Arguello, he went up 3 divisions, and until he lost to Aaron Pryor at junior welterweight. And I'm leaving a bunch out, but look at De La Hoya. I mean, De La Hoya started at featherweight, I believe, or junior lightweight. And,
I think so.
He was ended up being at one point, one of the middleweight champions of the world. So I think the intriguing part is when you have great fighters that want to fight each other, then it just makes it good. And just because a guy loses, somebody has to lose.
Yes.
Anything. If you're challenging yourself to be great, then I'm always going to be the first one to say, you know what, man, hats off to you. Much respect. You're still great. Because Sugar Ray Leonard lost to Roberto Duran for his first loss. It didn't mean he wasn't great. Tommy Hearn's first loss was to Ray Leonard. Doesn't mean he wasn't. Wilfred Benitez's first loss was to Sugar Ray Leonard. He ended up winning the junior middleweight title. He went up in weight to the junior middleweight and knocked out Maurice Hope from England, who was a really good champion. When Leonard went up to junior middleweight, he knocked out Ayub Koluli, who was from Africa, who was a really good champion. So all these fighters were intermixed around the 147 and 154, similar to when you had De La Hoya, you had Trinidad, you had Corte, you had Fernando Vargas, you had Shane Mosley, you had Vernon Forrest, you had Ricardo Mayorga. Remember this: De La Hoya lost to Trinidad.
Yep.
Trinidad beat De La Hoya. Hoya beat Vargas. Vargas beat Corte. Forrest beat Mosley twice. Mosley beat De La Hoya twice.
Yep.
But Mayorga beat Forrest twice. So they were all interchangeable. But what happened for 4 or 5 years was they all fought each other. And that was just great for boxing.
Yes, it is. I actually remember when I spoke with one of the commentators from ESPN, and he says that what it makes beautiful boxing is when you don't need to think about like dunking anybody. When you see the other fighter's opponent, or I mean in the other fighter's corner, and then you say, I want to fight this guy, you don't wait for a long time. But especially right now, I don't know if it is me or sometimes I get to see the politics are so so difficult in order that these fights can happen. I mean, we've been waiting for Errol Spence to face Crawford. There was another person, what's his name, Charlo, facing Jared Hurd, and woof, I don't know when it's gonna happen, but the fans, they want to see these fighters, and especially these fights. Hopefully, it will take place in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what happens is, excuse my phone ring. What happens is, first of all, the fighters want to have to do it, and I think once a promoter or a manager knows that a fighter wants a certain fight, then I think it gets a lot easier. There's always going to be the business aspect of it. You can't avoid that. Everybody wants to protect their investment, and there are egos involved. But I think you saw what happened. They made Wilder and they made Fury. Both got promoted by different people. They have different network affiliations. But what they did is everybody put the sword down and they made for a great event. Different times, that they did that for Wilder and Fury, and it was great for boxing. It was great for boxing. When that fight happened, boxing was hot, and then we ended up with the pandemic, and things really shut down for 4 or 5 months, and then we got a modified version, from July toward the end of the year, where fights were done in a bubble, and it was a little different, but at least we still got fights. We got Teofimo and Lomachenko. Sean Porter fought, Errol Spence, Danny Garcia fought, Canelo fought. There was a lot of big name fighters that were able to fight. So I think, we have a new year, and hopefully, we're optimistic about how things are going to go, health-wise in the world. And that's the most important thing, is that people everywhere get to stay healthy, is that we're able to move on and get back to some of this stuff.
Yes, sure.